So we're in week 4 of our journey on the road to resurrection, the journey that has many different pasos paradójicos, paradoxical parts to that path. We must be lost in order to be found. We must relinquish in order to receive. We must know our weakness in order to discover God's strength. And today, we learn that we must risk in order to discover true security. We must risk in order to discover true security. Well, I told you the story about rappelling and how I had to overcome fear in order to be able to be in the most secure and safe position. But there were other experiences along the way of my life that were significant risks. Sometimes not that I took, but that, for example, my parents took. Like when I was 11 years old and my parents got me involved in the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus, and they decided that it was a good thing for their 11-year-old son to get on a bus with 26 other adolescent and pre-adolescent boys, and only 4 adults, the bus driver, the director, the pianist, and our choir, our tour mom, and travel for 89 days out of the year across the United States in a Greyhound bus, singing 70 concerts in different communities all over the United States and southern Canada. They thought that was going to be a great experience, and they let me go. They kicked me out of the nest. And my brother said that was really a great time because he got to be the only child for a while, which was nice for him since I was the firstborn and he came second. There was always somebody else in the way. So I was gone for a while and they got to enjoy him, and that was great. But for me, it was fantastic. It was incredible at 11 years old to be given that kind of independence. It was absolutely phenomenal. And not only did my parents risk, but the choir director, we'd come into a town and we'd get there and we'd take all our stuff into the hotel, and then he'd have us meet in his room and he'd say, okay, $10, $10, $10, $10, and we all got $10. He'd say, you're on the town, you got to be back here by 5 o'clock so we can get ready to go to the show tonight. And we'd just be on our own. I learned how to manage my money, I learned how to take care of myself, I learned how to find my way in a strange town and find my way back. I learned how to do some things I probably shouldn't have learned how to do as well, but it was a phenomenal experience of independence. But oh my God, what a risk my parents took, and I didn't understand that until I was one. To shove your kid on the road at 11 to all these different places you've never been to. I got to do that for 3 years. 3 months out of the year, I traveled with this choir, singing all over the country and all over the world. And I grew up in phenomenal ways because of that experience. Ways I couldn't have done if I had stayed home. Then when I was 16, my parents were happy to get rid of me one more time. And they sent me to Nicaragua for 6 weeks to the jungle. They didn't know where I was going to be in Nicaragua. They just knew I was going to Nicaragua with this group called Amigos de las Americas to give vaccinations in a country that 2 years prior had had a horrible earthquake and was and had limited medical care. So we got on what was a paratrooper plane, no seats. We were just sitting on the floor of the airplane. You could look out through the cracks in the doors and see the jungle below you. And we flew to a little town called Ciuna, where we landed on a dirt airstrip and unloaded, and there we were, in this place that we couldn't get home from if we wanted to, unless somebody came to get us. And spent 6 weeks in a community that only spoke Spanish, and where we were giving vaccinations for any number of diseases for those 6 weeks. And it was, again, for me, an incredible experience. That's how I learned Spanish. That's how my heart broke for the poor of the world in a way that I never would have experienced had I not left my comfortable country club house in Tucson Country Club Estates. Wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't be here if that had not happened. And then the risk, as a white boy from a very nice neighborhood, to decide to move in with your family to the west side of San Antonio. where every couple weeks we heard drive-by shootings, and where the drug dealers were diagonally across from our house where we were raising our kids. And yet, if I hadn't made the decision to do that, I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't know you, and I wouldn't have the incredible joy of the 21 years of ministry that we've had together. I wouldn't have any of that if I hadn't taken that risk. So, risk-taking is a way in which, an important way in which, God grows us up and teaches us to rely upon things that we otherwise wouldn't rely on. Sometimes it's ourselves. We need to learn how to rely upon ourselves in an independent kind of way. But it's also how God teaches us to rely upon God. It's when we get outside of the places of comfort and familiarity that we are challenged to lean on God in ways that we otherwise wouldn't lean on God. And that's what the story that we just read today is about. It's not about risk-taking, because you're an adrenaline junkie. That's not what we're talking about. It's not risk-taking as an extreme sport, okay? It's about taking risks that invite growth and development of our lives and of our faith. Now, this story is one of those stories in the Gospels that sometimes hangs people up because people go, yeah, Jesus walked on water, right. And I want to talk to you folks for whom that might be a problem real quick. And just say that Marcus Borg did a great service for me and for many by saying, don't get hung up on the factuality of texts like this. They may have happened exactly that way, but they might not have. And what's important about these stories is the truth that they bear, the meaning that they offer us. And if we get hung up on or make the most important detail of the story, whether Jesus walked on that water or not, we can get completely distracted from what the most important point of the story is. All right? We can get distracted by that and say, oh, Jesus invited Peter to walk on water. He walked on water. So what we really ought to be about as a church is spending time out at Woodlawn Lake practicing how to walk on water together. No. No. Absolutely no. That is not the point of the text. It's not the point of the text. The point of the text is that God invites us out of our places of relative comfort onto places that feel insecure and threatening so that we can discover that God will hold us up. That's the point of the story. All right? And the way that unravels for Peter is that Jesus, and what you don't get in the text we read is that the antecedent for this is that John the Baptist just got his head cut off. And so it is a risky environment that these disciples are functioning within. All right? It is deadly risky environment that these disciples are in. The boat of the new church that has launched into the world is on very rough seas, very forceful winds. The winds of the Roman Empire and the Jewish power structure are against this boat. This boat is at risk. And yet the boat is the safest place to be in the midst of that storm. And even in that relative safety of that little church community that those disciples represent in that boat, Jesus comes to them in the midst of the storm and says, "You're still a little too secure, friends. Come on out here with me." Now Peter is scared, and understandably so. Some people have trouble stepping into the canoe. Imagine, if you don't know how to swim, being asked to step out of the canoe in the middle of the lake. The invitation is full of risk. but it's also full of promise. It's also full of potential for growth in trust. In The Heart of Christianity, Marcus Borg has a wonderful chapter where he unpacks the meanings of faith, which for many of us has come to be translated as belief in some statement, all right? But one of the meanings of faith that he unpacks is faith as trust. And the image that he uses for that, which I've shared with you before, is the image of a child who's learning how to swim and must learn that the water will hold him or her up if they can just relax and breathe. The water will hold them. And that essentially is what Jesus is inviting us to understand and to learn. The water will hold us because the water is God's grace underneath us. It is that kind of trust. It is that kind of trust that is fundamental security for our lives. Knowing that God will hold us. Servando's class studied the Confessions, and one of my favorite passages in the Confessions comes from a catechism that was written in Heidelberg. It's called the Heidelberg Catechisms. It's a series of questions that were constructed to try and make some peace between the Lutheran reformers in Germany and the Calvinist reformers out of Switzerland, who were banging each other's, people up, both figuratively and literally, in the battles during the Reformation. Because it wasn't just that the Protestants were disagreeing with the Catholic Church, but they disagreed with everybody else as well. Each group disagreed with every other group. And they were hammering out what their beliefs were going to be and where they were common and where they were distinguished from one another. And the German Lutherans and the Calvinists were not getting along, and they were pounding each other in this certain region of Germany. And so the king got them together and said, figure it out. And so they came up with this catechism. The first question of the catechism expresses profoundly for me that sense of security of God holding us up. The question that is asked of the catechumen is, what is your only comfort or your only security in life and in death? What is your only security or comfort in life and in death? And this is the answer. That I belong, body and soul, in life and in death, not to myself, but to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who also assures me of everlasting life and makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for Him. Wow. That's a profoundly secure place from which to live one's life. That I belong, body and soul, now and in death, to the God who loves me and holds me and will not let go of me. And because of that, I can give everything I am to serving that God. A couple weeks ago, I shared a story very briefly about my friend Bob Guinea, who's now in his 80s. But when he had just recently retired from a career in the military as an engineer, he had been moved by articles he had read in the San Antonio paper about what was happening to the young people who were being raised in some of the public housing complexes in San Antonio. The exposure to drugs, to prostitution, to gangs, to all kinds of destructive influences was literally robbing these young people of any future. And he remembered some words that a Jewish friend of his told him, a Jewish friend who had been in one of the concentration camps in Germany, in Nazi Germany. And this friend said to him, Bob, the most painful thing about my experience in Germany was not the concentration camp itself, but it was seeing how many people knew what was going on, and did absolutely nothing to change it. And Bob determined that he could no longer stand by and do nothing about what was happening to these kids' lives. And so with his army pension, he moved himself at almost 70 years old into the roughest part of San Antonio, literally right next door to the San Juan homes. And he began to live out of a very humble little building that he built there. And he'd walk into the courts and he'd get to know, and he had a bad leg and he would walk like this, and he was a large guy and he was white as white could be. And he'd walk into that community dressed very humbly, often in his sweatpants and a dirty t-shirt, and would get to know the families of the community. And one by one, he began to know a few families and began to work just with them. And if you went to Bob today, I know this is true, he would say there is nothing he did in his entire career that has been more meaningful than giving everything he had to these last few years of ministry to these families in that community. And he knows that there are many kids who have slipped through his fingers as well. But he knows that he did not stand by and do nothing. That kind of choice is a choice made from a faith like the Heidelberg Catechism articulates. I belong, body and soul, in life and in death, not to myself, not to my dreams, not to my wants, not to my children, but to Jesus Christ. And because he has given me assurance of this, all that I am can be placed in his service. That's what it means to step out of the boat. And not all of us may be asked to step out the way Bob did. But all of us are asked to step out of the boat somehow. Because you see, if we don't ever step out of the boat, then we don't really ever learn how to depend on God. We depend on ourselves, or we depend on our family, or we depend on our bank account, or our stock portfolio. Our security ends up being placed in things that are not God. Now, I think that what keeps us from stepping out of the boat is fear, most of the time. I think it's fear. Afraid of being hurt, afraid of losing something we don't want to lose, afraid of not achieving something we thought we should achieve, afraid of all kinds of things. But my friend Scotty Mueller, who wrote the song, "What Would You Do If You Weren't Afraid?" which we've sung, Hey Boys, a couple of times. His line in that song says, "But courage is faith on top of fear, so we can do your will right here." That is what this passage invites us to. And the road to resurrection is a road that invites us to step out of the boat, to step onto water that we don't think will hold us up, only to discover that it will. To step out in ministry, to risk resources, to risk self, for the good of someone else, and discover in the doing of that more life, more meaning, more faith than we ever knew we could have. If we want to be raised with Christ, then we must die with him. And taking those risks is the way we die to fear, so that we can live for the hope. So as you think today, where's God asking me to climb out of the boat? What is the way in which God is inviting me to risk something of myself in ministry, in service, in generosity? Maybe there's a milagro up here that can represent that invitation to risk. The promise we have is that if we risk, we will find that God holds us. God holds us. Not without suffering, perhaps, not without danger, not without things happening. But God will hold us, nevertheless, in life, in death, and in life beyond death. And that is something you can bank. Let's pray. Amoroso Dios, gracias por las personas a través de la historia quienes han arriesgado su confort, su comodidad, su interés propio, su bienestar, su dinero, para causa de su evangelio, para alcanzar a gente necesitada con el alivio que necesitan. Ayúdanos a tomar su ejemplo y arriesgarnos en búsqueda de una seguridad más amplia de lo que ya sabemos. Bendícenos en estos riesgos que asumimos en tu nombre. Por Cristo te lo pedimos. Amén.